So you are doing some tier one interventions, and it's time to keep track of the data to see if it's working. How do you do that? I want to give you some ideas on some methods I've used in the past, and maybe you like one of these and you take that up and use it for your own. But remember, you can do your own thing so long as you have something to show, because when we get to the end of tier one, we're going to need to prove that we've actually tried things and that they didn't work, right? Or if we want to try to escalate them to tier two. Also, if we are trying things, how do we know if they're working if we aren't actually collecting data and keeping track of that? So, I want to show you guys, first of all, I have this group intervention tracker over here. And what you can see is at the top, we have a skill, and maybe there's a link to the rubric that I use to actually grade that skill. And then I will put my name here at the top. And then this is a pullout group that I'm doing. And I have like 10 students. Each of them is a different color. And you see the dates in which I actually had my meetings. And the check marks mean that the people actually showed up. On the first line, I mark when the meeting is actually completed. And if the person is present, I put that underneath. And then there's a count on the bottom of how many people were present on that intervention. And then on the right side, I will have a list of my data. These are assessments where they're being graded by percentages, and this is where I would like them to be in each of these things. I want to see them make a steady progress. They're all uh, supposedly failing on this skill at the beginning, and I want to see them get improve as they go through it, at least on average, right? So maybe I should have been more aggressive with the targets, but I want to make steady gains. And, this is not done yet. I might have gone for a little while longer. It's going on for like about a month. Uh, if I wanted to really make a difference, maybe I would do a more like 8 weeks of intervention on the skill, how to do this. And this is an example of on engaging arguments in biology. So these kids were all pulled for interventions, and then we had assessments to see if they're actually improving on that skill. And on the right side column here, I have the percent change for each student to see if there's any movement on the student, and the actual change in the score itself and the value of the score on the next one. And then the last one just has a percent changed. Um, Now, the uh, bottom here, we have a graph where each of the colors that you see at the top are matched here in the graph. And so each of the lines represents that. And there's a black line to represent the targets. So people who are above that target, colors above the target, are students which are performing above my target. And there's also a gray line for averages. So wherever that gray line is, if you can see which students are above or below average. So you can see on average, they did improve throughout my thing. And maybe even better than the target when we moved up. So that was a good result. And I did have some students that pretty much stayed the same or fluctuated, but the overall trend is that a majority of students actually did had improvement, and I can kind of see the individual data and the gather data together. Now, this sheet, if you decide to use it, it's available on the MTSS support website, but it has automatic formulas to do all of this for you. So if you like it, you can do that. And you can click on a blank sheet if you click on the left side here, and it'll give you one that you can make a copy of in order to use it for yourself. There's a second tab in this document, though, that actually shows the interventions. So when I look at what's actually happening from 1 to 6, right, these are just a number of the interventions. If I switch to this tab, I can see what they are, right? The date in which it happens, the type of intervention, and maybe I would have put here with whatever the teacher and where the intervention took place, what I was trying to achieve with that intervention the day, and then what I actually did, maybe some links to some of the resources that I used and some patterns that I noticed during the intervention. And again, there's a link here to the blank sheet. And on the bottom, these are the assessments. So, like on the previous page, when you have the assessments, again, they're number of 1 through 8. That matches these assessments here, 1 through 8. So this sheet is basically just explaining what are these interventions and what are these assessments that were done. And you can see here that this is an intervention on writing arguments, right? And so uh, I did different things. I worked with them on a rubric. I showed them some resources. I had them work on judging some exemplars. We did a few prompts for argumentative writing. We uh, just trying to get them to improve on their scores, and it did make a difference. Now, group interventions are really awesome, and I strongly recommend that you don't go more than like 10 students. That's a lot already. I prefer something more like 5 or 6 students for a small group, and this is a tier one intervention. Anybody in that group is receiving that because I noticed from their data that they are lacking in that skill, and I thought that if I did a pull-out group with this, it would help them, and it did. So that's crazy, awesome. Now I have a very similar worksheet that you can use for a single student, and it's basically the same thing as the previous one, except instead of having a space for everybody, it just has data for one student, right? And then you can maybe um, have that had the same setup here, so you can actually track just a single student. All right, so the idea is still the same. You have one sheet that talks about what the interventions are and what the assessments were, and then one sheet that maybe has your results, right? So here I just pulled some sample data from the other sheet, but it's just for a single student, and you can see my targets and then the student's motion route to the target that I want them to move. And again, just like the other sheet, it automatically calculates. And you can use this if you're just doing a one-on-one intervention with a student, or if you just want to track the data separately. But it'll be the same kind of idea of the small group one, except you're just using it for one student. Because sometimes you will do an intervention just for a single student, and you can use something like this to do it. You could also just use a group sheet and just use one line instead of using all the lines. That's the same difference. But these are two resources that you could use to track some data. Then the other thing that you can do, it's much more simple, right? It's not, you don't get to get so fancy with the graphs and the table and all of that. You can just simply open a doc, right? Maybe put initials to represent the name of the student, and then you just write down what you do and what happens with the data, right? So maybe you say on the 9-1, did a resource intervention on writing argumentative prompts. And like, you could just be a graphic organizer plus video that explains how to use it, right? And then on 9-5, um, we basically made a one paragraph argument. Maybe you did a CER, claim evidence reasoning write up, and the student scored a 54% on the scale, right? And maybe you have the baseline score for the student before that, even on 9-1. So we're a baseline 52%, right? So there's not much improvement after that intervention. So it didn't really work. So we're going to continue the small group thing. Then maybe on the 9-7, I did some annotation work on exemplar versus critique of their own previous write up. Right? So I had a sort of walk through an assignment where they look at their assignment and critique it in comparison to a exemplar that they annotated, trying to look for the elements which I wanted to find. Actually, probably I would have done something more like I would have introduced some rubric breakdown in a small group with the student. And maybe a few days later, I actually had them annotate now that they had some exposure to the rubric. And maybe in between, I might have done an assessment on whether they understood the rubric. So maybe I do a rubric quiz, and this will be whether they understood what is expected from an argumentative piece, right? So there you go. That's an example of a log, right? And then so after they did the annotation assignment, maybe I gave them another prompt. I gave them another one paragraph CER prompt. And this time he scored a 64%. So the major improvement after that activity, right? Here you go. Something as simple as a log will do as well. But what you have to have is somewhere to collect that data, right? And I'll show you one more idea here in a second. So I had to black out here the personalized information about the students, but this is a tracker that I use in my class. And what I would do is I'll have the students in each row, and I'll have columns for different things that I'm paying attention to. So let's say, for example, this is a behavior tracker with different with data, and we have a student here on the first line who's routinely off task, and I am just writing down notes on how often the student is off task, right? And I'll just put a comment here. Every time the student is off task, I'll put a comment so that I can keep track of that data, right? Or when the student say is unresponsive, I will put a note, and I'll just keep a tally counter of how many times it happens. That's basically what I'm doing. And then I put a comment. I'll do Control Alt M and just put a qualitative comment that explains, like, off task, messaged on Go Guardian, no reply. Right, but this already shows you that I am doing interventions, right? I'm trying to get him, trying to use Go Guardian, right? And then I can try that for 2 weeks and see if it's making a difference. If it is not making a difference, I'll try something. I will try something different. Maybe at some point I will assign them on a reflection. Maybe at some point I'll pull them in and I did do this with this particular student. I, in fact, probably should log that on a comment here as part of the off-task intervention, because on 9:15, I actually had a SDL 101 on ideas to improve focus. And the next day, 9:16, I actually sent him a video on how to use focus timers, which I want him to start using in my class from now on. So there you go. So you can literally track all your interventions and whether or not the data is getting better by looking at the numbers and seeing if they're going up, right? And I might, if there's something new that I want to track, say if it's an academic skill or a different kind of behavior, I will create a new column with some sort of abbreviation that I'll remember, and I'll track that for because there's a student that needs to be tracked for that. So again, this is just a simple way to collect data that I can say these are the things that I'm putting in place. This is what's happening in response. And the last idea is that sometimes the intervention itself already has data within it, so that all you have to do to track it is to run the intervention. For example, this is a daily check-in sheet that I tend to use with students which are having trouble owning and keeping up with their work in class. And in this sheet, they actually have to review how they did that day in terms of habits of success, their behaviors, their work efforts, and also their class grade or attendance and stuff like that. So that perhaps the data that I'm interested in, if it was attendance or if it was behavior or if it was a class grade, is already in here. And so I can just link to this as the log itself. So sometimes you can use that. So sometimes the intervention itself might have the data. And the other thing I was going to say, like, let's say you were doing we had a student success meeting, and we took some notes on the student during the meeting. Maybe in that note document, we can put comments, or maybe you keep a log there, right? These are all different ideas on what you can do. And so what matters is that you collect data somehow. So here you see the student tracker, and you have these empty columns for MTSS, and they're actually meant for group interventions, right? So what you do is if you say, I have this student who are all part of an intervention that I'm doing together. And then over here at the top, you're gonna maybe claim that and say JBL, you know, science writing intervention, right? And then maybe you just make this a link, right? So you can create a link to that, and maybe you put a link to your group intervention data and tracker over here at the top, or to your log, or to whatever. you're using to keep track of what you're doing in that intervention. And that way, anybody can know what students are undergoing tier one or tier two interventions in a group setting. Now, remember, if they're actually having an individual MTSS level intervention, then what you will do is you put the date where that intervention begun. And you'll do something like 9/12, and then you're going to create a tag that will link to the MTSS document where you're keeping track of the results of those interventions. Right. So individual interventions are on the first column, and you can see if the student is progressing to higher levels of support. And if they're part of a pull-out group, we use the other columns for that. So um, this is just to tag, though, that they are under an intervention in order to actually show the results and practices which are happening during the intervention. You create links to that point where your data actually lives, whether it's a log on a doc or an upload of a sheet of paper where you wrote things down, or uh, uh, a spreadsheet like the ones I showed you. But everybody should be able to have access to know if we are actually formally doing an MTSS process, that these students have data being collected. Okay, so I hope you found this helpful. It's some ideas on how to do intervention tracking and monitoring, so that we can use this data to prove that we need to escalate the student to tier two if unfortunately the interventions do not respond, or from tier two to 3, which would be similar but log directly in EduClimber. I hope you found this helpful. I'll see you guys next time.